used to get bomb threats all the time, but then we realized that doesn't make sense because when we is there some type of killer in the school? Is there a weather alert? The teacher wouldn't answer in class. I was in band at the time, and the classroom phone rang, and the teacher went and really concerned, shocked look on his face, and he hung it up and he turned to us and he said, "Everybody sit down, be quiet. The bell's going to ring in a couple minutes. You're going to stay seated." And then he went over to the doors and he locked them. First, some of us were like, well, is it a bomb threat? Because we used to get bomb threats all the time, but then we realized that doesn't make sense because
we had never had a situation like this, and we had practiced so many drills, if there's a bomb, we all go to the band lot. If there's a tornado, we all go to the basement. If there's a fire, we take these exits on this side. We always had a plan, and this was just something that we had never planned, and nobody was telling us anything. So eventually, they're texting their parents and calling their parents, and they're saying, "Do you know anything about this?" And the parents are all freaking out, and now it's like an ordeal. Some of the parents started listening to the police scanners, and it was getting back to us that there were ambulances outside of our school, and we're just like... And at this point, a lot of us are panicking because we think there's some type of shooter or something, because that makes sense. Like, okay, the doors are locked. They're telling us to be quiet. They're telling us not to move. They're telling us not to leave. There's ambulances outside. And finally, they just opened the doors and let us go. And they wouldn't tell us anything still. So we're just like, okay, we just sat in this classroom for like hours. There's ambulances outside of our school, and you're just gonna...
room for like hours. There's ambulances outside of our school, and you're just gonna let us go to our next class? So you can probably tell by the title of this video what happened. A girl died in class during school hours. And here's the story on that. So earlier in that day, around like first, second period, somebody sold her a bunch of Oxycontins. She, during school, took all of them. She ended up going to her 7th period class at 3rd period, and she walked in and the teacher was like, "Honey, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Oh, I'm here for class." And the teacher was like, "You're not here until later, honey. It's only 3rd period." And I wasn't here for this, but supposedly when she walked away, she said to somebody else, "Oh, she's on something," or "She's drunk," or something. But it was obvious that she was on something. So she went a couple classes later and she put her head down on the desk. She was sleeping, and she was just kind of one of those students who, you know, showed up late and slept in class. Obviously didn't show a ton of interest in her teacher. He was a caring teacher, but he didn't wake her up. For I don't know what reason it was. I don't know if he just thought, you know, you can only try so hard to make somebody interested in class. I don't know if he figured, you know what, she could really use the sleep, just let her nap. But that class was over and the bell rang and everybody got up, but she stayed seated laying on her desk like this with her head down, and she wasn't getting up. So somebody who was sitting next to her nudged her and was like, "Hey, wake up, class is over." And she didn't move, and then she nudged her a little harder to wake her up, and that is when her arm fell completely limp to the side of the desk. So obviously at this point, people start panicking. They roll her over and she is completely blue. I don't know how long she was out. I don't know how long she wasn't breathing, but she had completely OD'd and had not been receiving oxygen for enough time to turn her blue. That is when the ambulances were called. That is when the school was put on lockdown. She was taken out, obviously, and she died that day.
This is why parents should believe their kids. In 2010, a 15-year-old boy started to notice that the door to his attic, which was in his bedroom, was always open. One day, when his mom's giving him a hard time about being lazy, he's like, "Well, you're one to talk. You always leave my attic door open." She's like, "I haven't touched your attic door in months, and nobody else has either." Not easily frightened, the boy decides to leave the attic door open. And so he's laying in bed, and he kind of looks over at the door, and standing in the door frame is a figure staring right at him. He bolts, tells his parents, they don't believe him, and then 6 months later they move anyway. A few years later, the boy discovers his favorite teacher actually moved into his old house. And so he jokingly asks her, "You ever see any ghosts walking around your attic?" Her face got completely serious, and she's like, "You know, as soon as we moved in, the door to the attic kept opening. So we investigated and we found a trap door that led onto the roof. Someone had been crawling in through that entrance and living in the attic for years." This is why you should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees for a split second the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months.
Time for another story time. I used to drink in a pub down in town. It was very cosy and typical for Yorkshire, where I live. Every time I went in, there was an old man who the locals referred to as Smiler, who always stood around the corner from the seating just outside the ladies' toilets. He was named this because of the huge vacant smile he always had on his face. This man had been there every time I'd been into the pub for over 20 years, no matter what time of day I went in. One day I went into the pub and the bar staff let me know that Smiler had sadly passed away. I had a few drinks with my friends and got up to go to the toilet, and as I walked around the corner, there was Smiler turning to face me. I was completely shocked, but walked to the door and said, "Hi, Smiler," to which he responded as usual with a nod, and I went into the toilet. I checked my lipstick and went back out, but Smiler was nowhere to be seen, and I haven't seen him since.
You should never go on a subway again. So what happened is that one night, a teenage girl was taking the subway home from work back to her house in New York. Scary part is when she went on board, she sat directly across from 2 men with a woman sitting in the middle. The creepy part is that the woman kept staring at her and wouldn't even blink, while the 2 men never once looked at her. Well, at the next stop, a man with a trench coat walked in, but the girl didn't pay much attention to him. The girl kept trying to look away so that one lady wouldn't stare at her, but she wouldn't even blink. Well, at the next stop, that random man with the trench coat pulled out the teenage girl and dragged her out of the subway. She was screaming, asking for help because she had no idea why this guy just pulled her out. But the guy told her to calm down and said he actually saved her life because the woman that was staring at her was actually dead, and the 2 men next to her were holding her up to make her look alive. The random guy with the trench coat said if he didn't pull her out, she was going to be their next victim.
Literally lived a nightmare. A 17-year-old girl was watching TV late at night when her motion detector lights in her driveway suddenly went on. She assumed it was just an animal, so she got up, drew the blinds, and went back to watching TV. Then a little bit later, it happened again. Before she could even react, she looks over and clearly makes out a silhouette of a person right behind the blinds who starts banging aggressively on the window. The girl stands up and goes, "I'm gonna call the cops!" And the figure stops for just a second, sprints to the side door and starts pounding even louder on that, screaming incoherently. The girl runs to the bathroom, barricades herself inside while she waits for the police, and then her worst nightmares come true. She hears glass shatter in the other room. After a few minutes of silence, she opens her door just a crack to get a peek outside, and standing in her living room next to a broken window is some crazy old woman who looks over at her and starts sprinting toward her. The lady comes smashing into the door and starts wailing on it until the police arrive and take her away. She was a lunatic who had escaped her facility. This is what they meant when they said, "Don't talk to strangers." In the early 1900s, a 10-year-old boy was playing in the woods when a tall man appeared and asked if he wanted to come back to his cabin for dinner. Totally caught off guard, the boy reluctantly agrees and begins walking. When they get to the cabin, the boy is relieved when he sees Paul, a family friend, sitting on the porch, so the boy happily goes inside. After they eat, the boy says thank you to the strange tall man, says bye to Paul, and then he leaves. He had only walked a few steps when he sees his family, along with Paul, running up the path towards him, frantically asking if he was okay. Confused, the boy says, "I'm just fine," and he looks at Paul and he's like, "Why didn't you tell them I was with you at the cabin?" And he points over his shoulder. Paul glances over the boy's shoulder and then narrows his eyes and says, "You were kidnapped by a cult 3 days ago. No one's seen you." Terrified, the boy turns around to look at the cabin he just came from, and it's gone. All he sees is a dark forest that stretches for miles.
Mary Cerruti was 61 years old and she was living alone. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people, but despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats. One of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary. They knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And something told them that something's off. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. The Houston police unlocked the door, they opened it up, and right away they were hit with this horrible smell. They looked off to their left and the right, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. After searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. But again, there was just nothing. The next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent. The husband decided to just go over on his own. At some point, he decides he wants to go up into the attic. He noticed one of the floorboards was kind of popped up, like it shouldn't be. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe. She stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight, and she kind of fell through it like a trap door. But when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident.